A homeless man named James sat quietly on the corner of a busy city street, blending into the background of chaos and indifference. His once proud life as a respected teacher had crumbled under the weight of personal tragedies, a series of unfortunate events that left him with nothing but bitter memories and a heavy heart. James was a man lost in the world, stripped of everything except his painful past. His world had become the sidewalk, the cold pavement his only companion, and the voices of those who passed by were distant and meaningless. He had been through so much and yet was overlooked by the very society he once served as a teacher. Before the streets, James had been a respected teacher, loved by his students and peers. He had a family, a home, and a sense of purpose. He'd spent years in the classroom, shaping young minds, giving his students the knowledge they needed to succeed. But life is unpredictable, and tragedy struck when he lost his wife and child in a car accident. This event shattered him. He sank into depression, lost his job, and was unable to cope with the overwhelming grief. Slowly, his life spiraled out of control. His friends and colleagues distanced themselves, not understanding the depth of his pain. James tried to move on, but he was broken, and with each failure, the weight of his grief grew heavier. The man who had once stood before classrooms full of students with confidence was now an invisible figure, hiding in plain sight on the streets. For weeks, months, and even years, James wandered from one corner to the next, desperately trying to hold onto some fragment of his old self. His clothes, once neat and tidy, were now torn and ragged. His face, once youthful and full of hope, had grown weary and weathered by time and hardship. His eyes, once bright with purpose, were now dull, lost in memories of a life he could never get back. But it wasn't just the physical changes that had affected James. His spirit had been crushed under the weight of rejection and loneliness. Each day, he would find a new corner to sit on, holding a cardboard sign that read, "Hungry and homeless. Please help." But the world seemed too busy to notice. People would walk past without a glance, too absorbed in their own lives to see the man who sat there, fading into the background. His sign was ignored. His presence was ignored. He felt invisible. There were days when he would sit for hours, barely able to keep his eyes open, hungry and tired. Some people would throw a few coins into his cup, but most would avoid eye contact altogether. James had long given up on expecting help. He had learned to live with the coldness of the world, to accept that no one cared. One afternoon, as James sat on the corner, a woman walking through the crowded street caught his eye. She was dressed elegantly, her presence calm amidst the chaos of the bustling city. Her demeanor stood out in stark contrast to the hurried pace of the crowd around her. She was someone who seemed unbothered by the rush, someone who took her time to look at the world with intention. As she walked past James, she stopped. James noticed her glance. For a moment, their eyes met, and he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. A connection, however brief. Most people would have looked away by now, too uncomfortable to acknowledge him. But she didn't. She stood still, staring at him for a moment longer than was customary, as if something in her wanted to reach out to him. James quickly looked away, not wanting to get his hopes up. He had learned over the years not to trust these fleeting moments of attention. They never led anywhere. But the woman didn't move on. She stepped closer to him, her heels clicking softly against the pavement. The noise of the street seemed to fade as she crouched down in front of him. "What's your name?" she asked, her voice soft yet firm, cutting through the noise of the city around them. There was no judgment in her voice, only genuine curiosity and concern. James hesitated. It had been so long since anyone had asked him something as simple as his name. He had been reduced to the homeless man or the beggar, and those labels had drowned out his true identity. "James," he said quietly, his voice shaky. The woman smiled gently and nodded. "It's nice to meet you, James. I'm Melania." She paused for a moment, giving him time to process her words before continuing. "Would you mind if I sat here for a bit?" James was taken aback. No one had ever asked him if they could sit with him, let alone someone like her. His mind raced. Why would she want to sit with him? What did she see in him that others didn't? But, despite his doubts, he nodded. Melania sat beside him, her presence calming, as though the world had slowed down for a moment. For the first time in a long time, James felt safe. He felt like someone cared. Melania didn't rush him, didn't pressure him to speak. Instead, she asked simple questions, allowing James to open up in his own time. After a few minutes, Melania leaned in slightly, her eyes compassionate. "James, I know this might sound strange, but I want to help you. I don't want to just walk away and forget about you like everyone else has." James felt a lump form in his throat. The words she spoke were so unexpected, so different from what he had heard from others. "Why would you want to help me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Melania met his gaze with kindness. "Because I believe everyone deserves a chance. And you, James, deserve a chance to rebuild your life." Just as hope began to bloom in James's chest, the situation took an unexpected turn. A local official, noticing the interaction between the two, approached with a sneer on his face. He glared at Melania and then at James with visible distaste. "Don't waste your time," the official said to Melania, his voice dripping with judgment. "These people are often fakes, pretending to be in need just to take advantage of good-hearted people like you." James felt the sting of the words. They were all too familiar. People had often accused him of scamming others, of using his circumstances to manipulate kindness. His shoulders slumped, and he looked away, ashamed. He didn't want Melania to be caught up in the mess that had become his life. But Melania didn't back down. She stood up, her eyes locked on the officials with a quiet strength. "You don't know his story," she said firmly, her voice unwavering. "And neither do I. But I won't judge him without knowing the truth." With that, she turned her attention back to James. She gave him a reassuring smile before promising, "I'll be back tomorrow. And when I do, I'll have a plan." True to her word, Melania returned the next day. But this time, she wasn't alone. She had brought along a team of volunteers, medical professionals, and social workers. She also had reporters from the local media to ensure that James's story would be shared with the public. The media attention was overwhelming, but it also forced the community to see the harsh realities of homelessness. It challenged people to confront the fact that many, like James, were falling through the cracks. With Melania's help, James's life began to change. He was given a place to stay, food to eat, and medical care for the health issues he had been neglecting for years. The support he received wasn't just physical, it was emotional too. For the first time in years, James felt hope. The most unexpected change, however, was his return to education. With Melania's connections, James was able to reach out to educational organizations. Soon, he was back in a classroom, teaching once again. The passion for teaching that had been buried under layers of grief and hardship was reignited. As he stood before a class of eager students, James felt like he had finally come back to life.